I never thought the day my family almost let me die would also be the day I stopped trying to earn their love. I wish I could say they didn't realize how serious it was. I wish I could say they were just scared. But the truth is, they thought I was lying. Last Saturday, my entire family gathered to celebrate my grandmother's birthday. It was supposed to be a happy day. Instead, it became the day I learned exactly where I stood in their lives. About 20 minutes after dessert, my chest tightened. My throat felt like it was shrinking. I tried to tell my parents I couldn't breathe, but the words wouldn't come out. I grabbed the edge of the dining table just to stay on my feet. My dad looked at me, rolled his eyes, and said, "Can you not make everything about yourself for once?" My mom didn't even look up from her conversation. She just sighed and muttered, "Ignore him. He'll stop when nobody pays attention." The room erupted in awkward laughter. I remember wondering if I was actually going to die, surrounded by 20 people who all believed I was putting on another performance. Then someone I had never met before stood up so fast that her chair crashed onto the floor. She took one look at me, turned completely pale, and screamed, "Does anyone here have an epinephrine auto-injector? Call 911, now." Everything changed after that, and by the end of that night, my family wasn't apologizing for doubting me. They were begging me not to tell anyone what had happened. Throwaway account because a few of my relatives use Reddit, and if this somehow reaches them, well, they'll probably recognize themselves anyway. I'm not looking for sympathy. I just need to tell someone the truth, because every time I think about that day, I still wake up in the middle of the night wondering how 20 people could watch someone struggle to breathe and assume it was all an act. To understand what happened, you need to know one thing about me. In my family, I was never the responsible one, the smart one, or the successful one. I was the dramatic one, at least that's what everyone called me. It started when I was a kid. If I cried after falling off my bike, my dad would laugh and say, "You're tougher than that. Stop putting on a show." If I complained that I felt sick before school, my mom would press the back of her hand against my forehead for exactly 2 seconds and announce that I was perfectly fine. When I sprained my wrist playing basketball at 13, my parents waited 3 days before taking me to urgent care because they thought I just wanted attention. It turned out to be fractured. Nobody apologized. Instead, my uncle joked during Thanksgiving, "Guess even fake injuries can become real if you commit hard enough." Everyone laughed, including my parents. After a while, I stopped defending myself. It was easier. When enough people tell you that you're overreacting, you eventually start questioning your own pain. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe everyone else was right. By the time I turned 24, I'd become the family member nobody took seriously. If I mentioned being stressed at work, someone would remind me that my cousin Emily had a real job. If I talked about feeling exhausted, my aunt would explain how she worked longer hours than anyone else. Every conversation somehow became a competition that I always lost. So eventually, I stopped talking. I showed up to birthdays, holiday dinners, anniversaries, family reunions. I smiled for pictures, answered questions with one-word responses. Then I went home. Honestly, I probably would have skipped my grandmother's 70th birthday if she hadn't called me herself. "Please come," she'd said over the phone. It wouldn't feel right without all my grandchildren. Grandma was different. She never called me dramatic. She never made jokes at my expense. She actually listened. So even though I knew exactly how the day would go, I couldn't say no to her. The party was held at my Aunt Linda's house. She had one of those huge backyards that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Freshly cut grass, white tables covered with gold decorations, balloons tied to every chair, and enough food to feed an entire neighborhood. By the time I arrived, nearly everyone was already there. Kids were running across the lawn. Music played through outdoor speakers. Someone was grilling burgers. The smell of barbecue drifted through the air. I spotted my parents almost immediately. Dad was standing near the grill, laughing with my uncles. Mom was helping arrange desserts. Neither of them noticed me. That wasn't unusual. I walked over to Grandma instead. The moment she saw me, her face lit up. "There you are," she wrapped me in the kind of hug that makes you feel like you're 10 years old again. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming." "I almost didn't," I admitted with a smile. She patted my shoulder. "I'm glad you changed your mind." For the next hour, things were surprisingly peaceful. I helped carry trays from the kitchen, refilled drinks, played soccer with my younger cousins. For a little while, I forgot how uncomfortable family gatherings usually made me. Then lunch started. The tables filled quickly. I ended up sitting near the far end with a few cousins I barely knew. Conversation bounced from vacations to work promotions to college admissions. I mostly listened. Halfway through the meal, my aunt asked, "So, are you still working at that marketing company?" "Yeah." "Still renting?" "Yeah," she nodded slowly. Oh, that single word somehow carried an entire speech. "You're behind, you're not successful, you're disappointing." I forced a smile. Across the table, Emily announced she'd just been promoted. Everyone applauded. Dad raised his glass. "That's my niece." Mom couldn't stop smiling. I congratulated her, and I genuinely meant it. But I couldn't help noticing that nobody had ever celebrated any of my accomplishments that way. Not once. Eventually, lunch ended. People began clearing plates. Someone brought out the birthday cake. It was enormous, 3 layers covered with white frosting and fresh strawberries. Grandma laughed as everyone sang. She looked happier than I'd seen her in years. After the candles were blown out, slices of cake were passed around. I accepted one without thinking. Now here's the part that's important. About 3 weeks before the party, I'd started seeing an allergist because I'd been having random skin rashes after eating certain foods. The testing process wasn't finished yet. The doctor suspected a food allergy but hadn't identified the trigger. She told me to be careful with unfamiliar desserts. I should have listened. Instead, I took a bite, then another. It tasted incredible. Sweet, creamy, almost homemade. I finished the entire slice. 10 minutes later, I noticed my lips tingling. At first, I ignored it. Then my ears started itching. That's weird. I scratched at my neck. Tiny bumps were forming across my skin. My heartbeat sped up. Maybe it was anxiety. Maybe I'd imagined it. I stood up and walked toward the drink table. Halfway there, something felt wrong, really wrong. It became harder to swallow. Like someone had wrapped invisible hands around my throat. I grabbed a bottle of water, took a sip. It barely went down. A cold wave of panic washed over me. Not because I thought I was dying. Because I suddenly remembered exactly what my allergist had warned me about. My breathing. I inhaled. The air felt smaller, like trying to breathe through a straw. I looked around. Everyone was laughing, talking, completely unaware. I found my mom near the kitchen door. "Mom!" My voice sounded strange, barely louder than a whisper. She didn't hear me. I tried again, this time louder. "I can't." She turned around, frowned, and sighed. "What now?" I pointed toward my throat. "I can't breathe." She looked at me for about 2 seconds, then rolled her eyes. "Oh, please." I stared at her. She crossed her arms. "You were perfectly fine 5 minutes ago." I opened my mouth again. Nothing came out except a raspy wheeze. Dad walked over. "What's going on?" Mom shrugged. "I think he's having one of his episodes." Dad didn't even ask me what was wrong. Instead, he looked directly into my eyes and said the words I'll never forget. "Can you stop making everything about yourself for one day?" Around us, several relatives had started watching. I wanted to explain. I wanted to scream that something was seriously wrong, but every second, breathing became harder. The edges of my vision blurred. And then, a woman I had never seen before stood up from across the yard. She stared at me for less than 3 seconds. Her expression changed instantly. She dropped her plate onto the ground. The ceramics shattered. Then she sprinted toward me. The first words out of her mouth sent every conversation at the party into complete silence. The entire backyard went silent. For a split second, nobody moved. The woman dropped to her knees beside me, gently grabbing my shoulders before looking directly into my eyes. "Can you hear me?" I nodded weakly. She looked at my face, then at my neck, where angry red hives had spread across my skin. "How long has this been happening?" I tried to answer, but all that escaped my throat was a strained wheeze. That was enough. She didn't hesitate. She turned toward the crowd and shouted loud enough for the entire party to hear. "Call 911. He's having a severe allergic reaction." Still, nobody moved. My uncle actually laughed. "I think you're overreacting." The woman stared at him in complete disbelief. "I'm a physician." Her voice was calm now, but it carried a sharp edge that immediately changed the atmosphere. If someone doesn't call an ambulance in the next 10 seconds, this young man could go into cardiac arrest. That finally got everyone's attention. My aunt fumbled for her phone. Someone else asked if they should drive me instead. "No," the doctor snapped. "If he stops breathing in the car, you'll have no equipment to help him. Call emergency services now." My vision was narrowing. The sounds around me became muffled, as though I were underwater. The doctor placed 2 fingers against my wrist. My pulse was racing. "Stay with me," she said. "I know it's hard, but keep looking at me." I wanted to, I really did, but every breath felt impossible. Across the yard, I heard my mother speaking. I didn't know it was real. Nobody answered her. For the first time in years, no one had a joke. No one rolled their eyes. No one called me dramatic, because now they could all see it. My lips were turning blue. The doctor quickly searched my pockets. "No EpiPen?" I shook my head. "I was still getting tested." She muttered something under her breath, then she looked at my aunt. "Does anyone here have an epinephrine auto-injector? Child? Adult? Anyone with allergies?" Everyone looked at each other. Nothing. "No." The doctor closed her eyes for half a second, clearly thinking through her options. Then she looked back at me. "Listen carefully." Her voice softened. "The ambulance is coming. I need you to stay awake. If you feel yourself getting sleepy, you fight it." I nodded again, or at least I think I did. Everything felt distant. Somewhere behind us I heard sirens, faint at first, then growing louder. The doctor finally let out a breath. "Good. They're close." My father slowly walked over. He looked different. The confidence he did earlier was gone. He knelt beside me. He swallowed hard. "I didn't know." The doctor didn't even let him finish. "It doesn't matter what you knew." She looked straight at him. "You ignored someone asking for help." The words hit harder than any shout could have. Dad lowered his head. For once, he had nothing to say. A minute later, the ambulance pulled into the driveway. Everything after that happened incredibly fast. Paramedics rushed toward me carrying equipment. One of them immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Airway compromised. Blood pressure dropping. Epinephrine, now. I barely felt the injection. Within seconds, oxygen covered my face. Cool air rushed into my lungs. It was an instant. It still hurt. But for the first time in what felt like forever, air actually reached my chest. I gasped, coughed violently. The paramedic squeezed my shoulder. "That's it. Keep breathing." Another medic asked rapid-fire questions. "Known allergies?" I managed to shake my head. "Any medications?" Another shake. The doctor who'd saved me answered most of them herself. She explained exactly what she'd observed. The paramedics listened carefully. Before loading me into the ambulance, one of them turned toward my parents. Which one of you is coming? Neither answered immediately, not because they didn't want to, because they were frozen, still trying to process everything. Finally, my mom whispered, "I'll go." Dad stood there staring at the ground. As they rolled the stretcher toward the ambulance, I caught one last glimpse of the backyard. Every conversation had stopped. My cousins looked terrified. My grandmother was crying. My uncle, the same one who had laughed, couldn't even look at me. The ambulance doors closed. The sirens started again. Inside, everything smelled like disinfectant. Machines beeped around me. One paramedic checked my oxygen levels while another started an IV. My breathing slowly improved. It still felt like someone had sandpaper inside my throat, but I wasn't suffocating anymore. My mom sat silently in the corner. She hadn't spoken since we left. About 10 minutes into the drive, she finally broke the silence. "I thought," her voice cracked. "I honestly thought you were pretending." I stared at the ceiling. I didn't answer. Because there wasn't anything left to say, she started crying. Real crying, the kind I'd never seen from her before. "I'm so sorry." Still, I couldn't respond, not because I wanted revenge, not because I hated her, but because something inside me had changed. When you spent years begging people to believe you, and they only do it after watching you almost die, an apology doesn't magically erase that. At the hospital, everything became a blur of tests, medications, and questions. Doctors confirmed what the emergency physician already knew. Severe anaphylaxis, one more delay, even just a few extra minutes, could have been fatal. The attending physician looked directly at my parents. If that doctor hadn't recognized the symptoms immediately, your son might not have survived. The room fell silent. Mom buried her face in her hands. Dad looked like he'd aged 10 years in one afternoon. Hours later, after I'd stabilized, the physician who had saved me stopped by my room before leaving. She smiled gently. "You scared us." I managed a weak smile. "You saved me." She shook her head. "I did my job." Then she hesitated. "But your family." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Before leaving, she handed me her business card. "If anyone asks what happened," she paused, "don't let anyone rewrite the story." At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. I would, because by the next morning, my family had already started changing their version of events. And I was about to discover that surviving the allergic reaction was actually the easiest part. I spent the night in the hospital. The doctors wanted to keep me under observation because severe allergic reactions can come back even after the first symptoms disappear. They called it a biphasic reaction. I didn't care what it was called. I was just exhausted. My throat still burned every time I swallowed. Every deep breath reminded me how close I'd come to never taking another one. Around 6 the next morning, I woke to the sound of quiet voices outside my room. "My parents, don't tell him yet," my mom whispered. "I'm not saying we should lie," my dad replied. "I'm saying the family doesn't need to hear every detail." I stayed still. For some reason, hearing those words hurt more than everything that had happened the day before. Not how is he feeling, not we almost lost him. Their first concern was the family's reputation. A few minutes later, they walked in. Mom looked like she hadn't slept. Dad avoided eye contact. "How are you feeling?" Mom asked carefully. "Better." "I'm glad." Silence. Dad cleared his throat. "Listen, about yesterday." I waited. "We made a mistake." I nodded. "Yeah." Another long silence filled the room. Then he said something I never expected. "But maybe when everyone asks about it, we don't need to make it sound worse than it was." I stared at him. "Worse than it was?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "You know how families are. If people think we ignored you—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. I finally understood what that doctor meant. Don't let anyone rewrite the story. They weren't trying to understand what happened. They were trying to control how people remembered it. I looked at my father for a long moment. Then I asked quietly, "Did you tell me to stop making everything about myself?" He froze. "Yes." "Did Mom tell everyone to ignore me?" Neither of them answered. "Did Uncle Brian laugh?" More silence. I looked from one parent to the other. "So what exactly would I be exaggerating?" Neither had an answer. An hour later, they left so I could rest. The moment the door closed, my phone exploded with notifications. Missed calls, texts, voicemails. Most were from relatives. At first, they sounded concerned. "Hope you're okay. Scared us yesterday. Glad you're feeling better." Then I reached my Uncle Brian's message. "Hey, buddy, sorry if you misunderstood yesterday. We all thought you were joking because you've always had a dramatic sense of humor." I read it 3 times. Not an apology, an excuse. Then came another message from my aunt. "Nobody intentionally ignored you. Things just happened very fast." Very fast? I'd struggled to breathe for several minutes before anyone helped me. The only person who reacted immediately was someone who had never met me before. By lunchtime, I was discharged with prescriptions, a referral to an allergy specialist, and 2 EpiPens. The nurse demonstrated how to use them. "Carry one everywhere," she said, "and don't worry about embarrassing yourself. If you think you're having another reaction, use it." Her words stuck with me. Don't worry about embarrassing yourself. Funny. That had been my biggest fear my entire life. I went home alone. My apartment had never felt so quiet. For the first time since the incident, I allowed myself to cry, not because I'd almost died, because I realized something much harder to accept. If that doctor hadn't been at my grandmother's party, my family would have watched me collapse, and many of them would have assumed I was pretending until it was too late. That thought wouldn't leave my head. 2 days later, Grandma called. The moment I answered, she started crying. "I'm so sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for," I said. "Yes, I do." Her voice shook. "I invited everyone. I should have seen what was happening. You couldn't have known. No, she paused, but I should have raised children who listened. That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Grandma asked if I'd visit her later that week. I agreed. When I arrived, she was sitting on her porch with 2 cups of tea. She hugged me for a long time, longer than usual. Then she looked me straight in the eyes. Tell me everything. So I did. I told her about being called dramatic growing up, the broken wrist, the jokes, the eye rolls, the years of never being believed. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she wiped away a tear. I failed you. You didn't. I did. She looked toward the garden. I always hoped your parents would outgrow that behavior. I didn't realize how much damage it had done. For nearly an hour we talked, really talked. It was the first time anyone in my family had ever listened without trying to defend themselves. As I was getting ready to leave, Grandma disappeared inside. She returned carrying a small wooden box. I've been meaning to give you this. Inside were old photographs, letters, birthday cards. Then she handed me an envelope. I think you're old enough to read this now. It was addressed to me, written 20 years earlier. My name was on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. Who wrote this? I asked. Grandma smiled sadly. Your grandfather. He wrote a letter for every grandchild before he passed away. I promised I'd give each of you yours when the time felt right. I carefully opened it. The paper had yellowed with age. Most of the letter was filled with advice. Work hard, be kind, protect your peace. Then one sentence caught my attention. The people who love you should never make you feel like your pain is an inconvenience. I stopped reading. It felt like he somehow knew exactly what my life would become. Grandma watched my expression change. He was very wise. I folded the letter carefully. I wish I'd known him longer. So do I. As I stood to leave, Grandma grabbed my hand. There will be a family dinner this Sunday. I immediately shook my head. I'm not coming. I understand. But, she hesitated. I think there are some things your parents need to say. I laughed quietly. They've already apologized. No, she looked unusually serious. They apologized because you survived. What they need to do is admit what they did. I wasn't convinced that would ever happen. Still, I agreed to think about it. That evening my phone rang again. Dad, I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. We're having dinner Sunday, he said. I know. I'd like you to come. Why? A long pause. Because I need to tell everyone the truth. For the first time since the hospital. I believed he actually meant it. What I didn't know was that someone else had already decided to tell the truth first. And by Sunday morning, the stranger who saved my life had posted about what happened online. The post was spreading faster than anyone in my family could stop it. By Sunday morning, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. At first, I assumed it was more messages from relatives. It wasn't. It was people I hadn't spoken to in years. Old classmates, former coworkers, even my college roommate. Every message asked the same thing. Is that story about you? Confused, I opened the first text. There was a screenshot attached. The title read, I watched an entire family ignore a young man having anaphylaxis until he nearly died. The post had been written by the emergency physician who had saved my life. She never mentioned my name. She never mentioned my family's names. She never said where it happened. But she described everything she had witnessed. How a young man repeatedly tried to ask for help. How multiple relatives dismissed him as dramatic. How no one moved until she identified the allergic reaction. And how the family became more concerned about their image afterward than acknowledging what had happened. The final sentence hit me the hardest. The biggest danger wasn't the allergy. It was that the people closest to him had stopped believing him long before he stopped breathing. The post spread quickly. Thousands of comments poured in. Most weren't angry. They were heartbroken. Many shared similar experiences of having their pain ignored because they had been labeled too emotional or too dramatic. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't alone. That afternoon, I drove to my grandmother's house. The atmosphere was completely different from the birthday party. No music, no laughter, just silence. When I walked through the front door, every conversation stopped. My parents were already there, so were my aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandma. No one looked comfortable. Grandma gestured toward an empty chair beside her. Sit. I did. For almost a full minute, nobody spoke. Finally, my father stood up. He looked around the room before taking a deep breath. I asked everyone to come because... He paused. I've spent the last week trying to convince myself that what happened wasn't entirely my fault. He looked directly at me. But it was. The room stayed silent. I told my son he was making everything about himself. I ignored him when someone else tried to help. I didn't. His voice cracked. I almost buried my own child because I assumed I already knew the truth. My mother started crying. Then she stood beside him. I did the same thing. I taught everyone here that whenever he complained, it was attention-seeking. I laughed. I rolled my eyes. I made other people stop listening too. She wiped tears from her face. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted everyone to hear the truth from us. No excuses, no blaming stress, no pretending it happened differently, just the truth. One by one, other relatives spoke. My Uncle Brian, the one who had laughed, walked over to me. I don't deserve your forgiveness. No, I replied honestly. He nodded. I know. I'll regret those few seconds for the rest of my life, for the first time. No one argued with me. No one minimized what happened. No one called me dramatic. Grandma finally broke the silence. I've spent 70 years believing that family means standing by each other. She looked around the room. But family isn't about sharing the same last name. It's about making someone feel safe. Then she turned toward me. I'm sorry this family failed you. I couldn't stop the tears anymore, neither could anyone else. After dinner, people slowly left. There were no dramatic speeches, no magical moment where everything suddenly became perfect. Real life doesn't work like that. Over the next several months, things changed, but slowly. My parents started family counseling, not because I demanded it, because they admitted they needed it. Dad called every week. Sometimes we talked for an hour, sometimes only 5 minutes, but he kept calling. Mom apologized more than once. Eventually, I asked her to stop, not because I had forgotten, but because I wanted our conversations to be about building something new instead of reliving the worst day of my life. As for me, I finished allergy testing. The culprit turned out to be a rare tree nut ingredient hidden in the homemade frosting. I now carry 2 EpiPens everywhere. People sometimes ask why. I don't feel embarrassed anymore. Because I'd rather explain an EpiPen than depend on someone deciding whether my emergency looks convincing enough. A few months later, I met the emergency physician again. This time under much better circumstances. I invited her to lunch. She almost refused. I don't usually meet patients outside the hospital. I know, I said, but I never really got to thank you, she smiled. So, how's your family? I thought about the question. They're trying. And you? I'm trying too, she nodded. That's all anyone can do. Before we left, she gave me one final piece of advice. Never ignore your instincts just because someone else is uncomfortable with them. That sentence changed the way I lived. I stopped apologizing for speaking up. I stopped minimizing my own pain. I stopped chasing approval from people who had already decided not to believe me. A year after the incident, my grandmother celebrated her 71st birthday. This time it was much smaller, just immediate family. When dessert was served, my mother quietly asked, "Can you check the ingredients first?" I smiled. She wasn't treating me like I was dramatic anymore. She was treating me like someone worth protecting. It was a small question, but it meant everything. Looking back now, I don't think the worst part of that day was almost dying. The worst part was realizing I'd spent years trying to convince people my feelings mattered. The best part wasn't surviving. It was finally understanding that I didn't need permission to take my own pain seriously. If someone tells you they're hurting, believe them. Even if they're wrong, kindness costs almost nothing, but disbelief, sometimes it costs everything.